Welcome back to Crime Time Inc. This time, we're going all the way back to 1692 to Salem, Massachusetts. Can you imagine a community completely consumed by Puritan beliefs, grappling with all kinds of social tensions, and still, reeling from recent conflicts with Native Americans?
Yeah, it's like a recipe for unrest, isn't it? You've got all these ingredients and then boom, the Salem Witch Trials.
So how do these accusations and trials actually get started?
Well, it all begins with a group of young girls. They start experiencing these really strange fits, contortions, and disturbing visions. And the doctor at the time, he's completely baffled by it all. He can't explain what's happening with the medical knowledge of the time. So what does he do? He declares them bewitched.
Bewitched. That's a seriously loaded word, especially for a community that's so deeply rooted in religious beliefs. It sounds like that was the spark that ignited the entire fire.
You got it. And from that moment on, a tidal wave of accusations just swept through Salem. Over 200 people ended up being accused, and a staggering 20 were executed for the supposed crime of witchcraft.
20 people executed. That's a devastating number. To try and wrap our heads around how things escalated so quickly, let's delve into the lives of some of those caught in the crosshairs of the Salem Witch Trials. The accusers and the accused both have roles to play in this really complicated story.
Absolutely. Let's start with Bridget Bishop. She was the very first person executed in the trials, and her case is a pretty stark example of how accusations were made and how deeply social bias impacted things.
So what was it about Bridget that made her a target?
Well, for one, Bridget was considered to be a little bit different. She had what you might call a colorful personality, wasn't afraid to challenge the norms, and had a bit of a reputation for being, let's just say, outspoken. Even before the trials, years of rumors and whispers had already kind of painted her in a negative light in the community.
So she was already seen as an outsider, someone who didn't quite fit the mold. And then on top of all that, she's accused of bewitching 5 young women. In a community that's already on edge, it sounds like that was a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, the main evidence used against her was something called spectral evidence.
Now, wait a minute. What is spectral evidence?
Well, this is where the trials take a seriously disturbing turn. Spectral evidence was testimony based on nothing more than dreams and visions. Imagine being accused and convicted based on someone's dream about you. It's impossible to disprove, totally subjective, and wide open to manipulation.
That's terrifying. To think your fate hangs on something as intangible as a dream? No wonder securing a conviction was so easy. But spectral evidence wasn't just used in Bridget's case, right?
Unfortunately, no. It became like this recurring nightmare throughout the trials, fueling the fear and making it basically impossible for anyone accused to even defend themselves. And then there's the case of Rebecca Nurse, which really exemplifies how these trials escalated.
Okay, so what made Rebecca Nurse's case different?
Now, Rebecca Nurse, she was a well-respected and pious member of the community. Her execution sent shockwaves through Salem because it showed that the trials weren't just targeting those considered to be on the fringes of society, the so-called usual suspects. The accusations had reached a point where even upstanding citizens were vulnerable.
So the net was widening, and even those who were once considered beyond reproach were suddenly under suspicion.
It paints a pretty clear picture of the grip of mass hysteria and the suffocating fear that had taken hold in Salem. When someone like Rebecca Nurse could be accused and convicted, it was clear that the trials had spiraled out of control. Another one that highlights the religious tensions is the case of George Burroughs.
George Burroughs. What was it about his case that made it stand out?
So George Burroughs was a Puritan minister. In fact, he was the only minister to be executed during the Salem Witch Trials. The really interesting thing about his case is that he was accused of being a sort of ringleader of witches. Some historians suggest that this accusation stemmed from the fact that his beliefs differed somewhat from mainstream Puritan doctrine.
So even into community as seemingly unified in their faith as Salem, even subtle variations in belief could land you an accusation of witchcraft. Sounds like even a simple disagreement could have dire consequences.
That's right. The trials ended up exposing the fragility of religious unity and how these theological disputes could easily morph into accusations of demonic influence. And it wasn't just religious figures getting swept up in all of this. Let's talk about Tituba, an enslaved woman whose story played a significant role in the events that unfolded.
What was it about Tituba's case that made it so significant?
Well, she was one of the first to be accused and also the first to confess. Now, her confession, almost certainly coerced, had this ripple effect, setting a dangerous precedent for the trials. All of a sudden, confessing and then accusing others became a twisted survival tactic in a system where staying silent was often seen as an admission of guilt.
So whether genuine or not, Tituba's confession basically laid out the blueprint for this whole cycle of accusations that fueled the trials. It became this terrifying game of self-preservation.
Precisely. And her case really exposes the power imbalances at play. As an enslaved woman, Tituba was incredibly vulnerable in a system that offered her little protection or a voice. The trials exploited existing social hierarchies and prejudices, making those who were already marginalized even more susceptible to accusations.
You know, when we look at all the people accused in Salem, are there any common threads or patterns that we can identify?
Yeah, it's striking how many of the accused shared certain characteristics. They were often women, individuals who lived on the fringes of society, those who dared to challenge authority or simply didn't conform to the strict social norms of Puritan Salem. The trials seemed to target those who were already vulnerable or perceived as different.
It sounds like the accusations themselves reveal the anxieties and societal pressures of the time. The trials become a lens through which we can examine the cracks in this seemingly unified community.
That's a very insightful way to put it. By looking at who was targeted, we gain a much deeper understanding of the hidden tensions and fears simmering beneath the surface of Salem society.
Okay, so we've looked at those accused. But what about those making the accusations? Who were the accusers in Salem, and what was it that motivated them?
Well, the accusers were primarily a group of young women, names like Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and Putnam Jr., and Mercy Lewis. Their accusations were theatrical and often accompanied by fits and visions which seemed to lend credence to their claims of bewitchment.
It's tempting to just write them off as hysterical or attention-seeking, but knowing the context, their actions probably stem from something much deeper.
Absolutely. While some historical accounts tend to label them as simply hysterical, it's essential to consider the psychological and social factors that were at play. These were young women living in a society that was incredibly restrictive, a society that offered them limited autonomy and agency. Their actions, no matter how extreme, could have been a response to their environment, a way to exert a degree of control or attract attention in a world that offered them little of either.
So their accusations could be viewed as a form of rebellion, or maybe even a desperate attempt to break free from the rigid roles dictated by their society.
That's a plausible interpretation for sure. Some historians have suggested that boredom, a thirst for attention, or even repressed trauma or abuse could have played a role. We can't discount the possibility of mental illness, or maybe even just teenage vindictiveness.
It's like a big puzzle, isn't it? To try and understand the motives of these young women centuries later, we have to look at the complexity of their lives, the societal pressures they were under, and the limited options available to them.
You're absolutely right. And to further complicate things, you have spectral evidence being used to corroborate their claims, which makes it even more difficult to distinguish genuine distress from potential manipulation.
Right. Speaking of complicating things, wasn't there a case where one of the accusers, Mary Warren, I think her name was, actually recanted her accusations?
You're thinking of Mary Warren, yes. Her case really throws a wrench into the narrative. It raises questions about the authenticity of the accusations as a whole. She claimed that the other accusers were dissembling, implying an element of fabrication or performance in their claims.
So we can't rule out the possibility of personal agendas or ulterior motives driving these accusations. Were there other things at play here beyond religious beliefs and individual motivations? What about the wider social and political landscape of Salem? Did any of that play a role in how the trials unfolded?
Absolutely. We can't forget that the Puritans firmly believed in the devil's power and saw witchcraft as a very real and present danger. Their worldview, combined with the legal framework of the time, basically created the perfect breeding ground for a witch hunt.
So what was the legal system like in Salem at that time? How did it factor into all of this?
Well, the legal system in Salem was really a reflection of the Puritan worldview. They believed that witchcraft wasn't just a sin, it was a crime against the community as a whole. The lack of anything resembling due process as we understand it today, coupled with this heavy reliance on spectral evidence, resulted in a system where accusations could easily lead to convictions.
It sounds like the system was ripe for abuse, and the intense pressure to confess, especially when confessing was often the only way to avoid execution, must have added to the chaos and injustice.
That's exactly right. Confessions, whether they were genuine or coerced, were highly valued in the legal system of the time. They were seen as conclusive proof of guilt and often led to leniency, sometimes even freedom, for the one confessing.
But as we've seen, many of those confessions were likely coerced, made under duress or extracted through promises of leniency.
You've hit the nail on the head. The pressure to confess was immense, and it created this perverse incentive for the accused to start pointing fingers at others, which in turn fueled the cycle of accusations even further.
So in a twisted way, the legal system, instead of protecting the innocent, was actually perpetuating the very injustices it was designed to prevent.
That's a great way to put it. The Salem Witch Trials really exposed the weaknesses of a legal system that lacked proper safeguards against false accusations and the abuse of power.
It's a chilling reminder that even with a legal framework in place, justice can be incredibly elusive, especially when fear and prejudice take hold.
That's a great point. The Salem Witch Trials really serve as a warning from history. They highlight the importance of due process, the presumption of innocence, and the crucial need for a legal system that upholds the rights of all, not just some.
So we've got society teetering on the edge, a group of young women making these dramatic accusations, and a legal system that's not equipped to deal with any of it. It was a recipe for disaster. But in the midst of all the talk of witchcraft and the supernatural, were there any other explanations being offered for what was happening in Salem?
There were a few really interesting alternative explanations put forward. One of the most fascinating is the Ergot theory.
I've heard of that. What's the Ergot theory all about?
Well, it suggests that those strange symptoms exhibited by the accusers could have actually been caused by ergot poisoning. Ergot's a fungus that can grow on rye grain, and consuming contaminated grain can trigger hallucinations, convulsions, and some really bizarre behavior. There are scholars who argue that the symptoms described in the trials actually align pretty well with ergot poisoning.
Wow, so instead of some supernatural force at work, it could have just been food poisoning. That's a fascinating twist. Makes you wonder how many other potential explanations were overlooked in the fervor of the witch hunt.
And it raises a really crucial question. Could it be that a simple biological factor was misinterpreted as witchcraft? It adds another layer of complexity to this whole saga and makes us think about the limits of what people understood and knew back then.
We've covered a lot of ground today. The historical context, the accused and the accusers, the legal system, even these alternative explanations. But I feel like we're just scratching the surface of this complex and tragic chapter in history.
I agree. The Salem Witch Trials are this intricate web of individual stories, societal anxieties, and specific historical circumstances. To really grasp the full scope, we need to keep digging, keep asking questions, and keep learning from this dark period in American history.
And that's exactly what we'll be doing. Stay tuned, because in our next segment, we'll take a deeper dive into the lasting impact of the trials and the lives that were forever altered by this tragic chapter in American history.
It's important to remember that the Salem Witch Trials weren't just about these abstract concepts, societal anxieties or religious fervor. This was about real people, people whose lives were completely and utterly changed by these events.
Right, we've talked about the broader historical context. But to really grasp the true human cost of what happened, we need to focus on the individuals and the people whose lives were shattered.
Yeah, their stories give us a glimpse into the fear, the desperation, the sheer injustice that define those dark months.
One of the most disturbing cases, I think, has to be the story of Giles Corey. He refused to enter a plea when he was accused of witchcraft. He basically just refused to play along with a system that he saw as rigged against him from the start.
It's remarkable, really, Corey's defiance. He understood that by pleading either guilty or not guilty, he was essentially submitting to a process that was inherently unfair. Staying silent was his way of protesting the injustice he saw happening all around him.
But instead of giving him a fair trial, they decided to punish him with this horrific torture method called peine forte et dure. They basically crushed him to death with heavy stones.
Yeah, it was brutal. They used it to force confessions and silence anyone who dared to speak out against the trials. Corey's willingness to endure such unimaginable pain rather than give in to this corrupt system is a testament to his courage.
It's a chilling reminder of the lengths they went to enforce conformity and silence dissent. And it wasn't just physical punishment. The psychological toll on those accused was immense.
Think about Sarah Good. She was pregnant when they arrested her and gave birth in prison. Tragically, the baby died shortly after.
God, it's heartbreaking to think about the despair of being accused of something so horrible, imprisoned in those conditions, and then losing your newborn child. Her story shows just how far the impact of the trials reached, how much suffering they caused, even for those who weren't directly accused.
And that's not even the end of it. Sarah Good's 6-year-old daughter, Dorcas, was also accused and imprisoned. Can you imagine the trauma of a child caught up in this hysteria?
A 6-year-old accused of witchcraft. It seems like the accusations had just completely spiraled out of control at this point. Not even children were safe from suspicion. The fear had permeated every corner of the community.
Absolutely. And the impact on families was devastating. Take the case of George Jacobs Cerner. His own granddaughter, Margaret Jacobs, accused him of witchcraft. The trials were tearing families apart, creating this atmosphere of suspicion and betrayal.
I mean, to think about the breakdown of trust within families, it's almost impossible to comprehend. But even in all of this darkness, there were those who questioned the trials and spoke out against the injustice.
Yes, there were these voices of reason who started to emerge. Some had been believers at first, but they became disillusioned as they witnessed the blatant lack of due process and the over-reliance on spectral evidence. Their courage in speaking out against the accepted narrative is a testament to the human capacity for critical thinking, even in the face of such overwhelming fear.
One of those figures was Reverend John Hale. He was initially a supporter of the trials, but over time he became increasingly troubled by what he was seeing.
Hale began to doubt the legitimacy of the accusations and the fairness of the proceedings. He started questioning the use of spectral evidence and advocated for more caution and fairness in the legal process.
It's incredible that someone like Hale, who was so deeply entrenched in that belief system, could evolve and challenge his own assumptions. He eventually came to the conclusion that the trials had gone terribly wrong, and he used his position to try and bring about change.
Yeah, his transformation shows us that it is possible to change our minds even about deeply held beliefs when we're confronted with evidence and reason. It's a powerful reminder of the importance of critical thinking.
And there was Thomas Brattle. He was a wealthy merchant in Boston. He wrote this really scathing critique of the trials. He questioned the evidence, the fairness of the proceedings. He was particularly concerned about the use of spectral evidence, which he saw as completely unreliable and dangerous.
Brattle's critique was important because it came from someone outside of Salem, someone who wasn't caught up in all the hysteria. He could offer a more objective perspective, and his words carried a lot of weight because of his social standing.
There's this quote from him where he expresses his fear that the legacy of the trials would stain the colony for generations to come. He said, "Ages will not wear off that reproach and those stains which these things will leave behind them upon our land."
Yeah, he understood that the Salem witch trials were not just some isolated incident. They were a reflection of some really deep-seated societal issues. He saw them as a warning about the dangers of mass hysteria and the abuse of power.
And he was right. The Salem Witch Trials became this cautionary tale, a stark reminder of what happens when fear and suspicion run rampant, and the legal system fails to protect those who are innocent.
They remind us that the events of Salem are not some distant historical curiosity. They offer lessons that are still relevant today.
It's easy to look back on those events and judge the people involved, but we have to remember that we're not so different from them.
We may have different beliefs, different fears, but the human capacity for fear, for prejudice, for scapegoating, that's still very much with us.
And that's why we have to ask ourselves, what can we learn from this dark chapter in history? What can we do to prevent this kind of injustice from happening again in our own time?
That's a question we all need to be grappling with. The Salem witch trials are a powerful reminder of the fragility of justice and the constant need to protect the rights of individuals, especially in times of crisis.
But was there any sense of remorse? Did anyone involved in the trials ever acknowledge the wrongs that had been committed?
Some did. Years after the trials, one of the judges, Samuel Sewell, publicly apologized for his role in the proceedings. He even fasted one day a year for the rest of his life as a way of showing his repentance.
Wow. That's pretty remarkable. It seems like as time went on and he had more time to reflect, and maybe as awareness of the magnitude of the injustices grew, he came to truly regret his actions.
His apology is a testament to the possibility of personal growth and the importance of acknowledging the mistakes we've made. It also serves as a reminder that even if justice is delayed, it's not always denied.
It's a message about taking responsibility for our actions and trying to make amends for the harm we've caused.
And it highlights the importance of remembering the past. Not just as a bunch of facts and dates, but as a source of valuable lessons that can help guide us in the present.
You know, we've talked about the human cost, the voices of dissent, the lasting impact of the trials. But I think to really grasp the legal complexities that contributed to these events, we need to look at the legal framework that was in place in Salem at the time. How did their understanding of the law play a role in the injustices that took place?
That's a crucial question. The legal system in Salem was very much a product of its time. It reflected the Puritan worldview and their specific ideas about justice. By looking at the trials through this legal lens, we can start to understand how accusations could escalate into convictions and how a community struggling with fear and uncertainty could end up in such a tragic situation. When we talk about the legal framework in Salem back in 1692, the biggest thing to remember is that the Puritans genuinely believed in witchcraft.
Okay, so witchcraft wasn't just some theological idea for them. It had real legal implications.
You got it. For them, witchcraft was a serious crime, a threat to both their religious and social order. And their legal system was set up to reflect that.
I see. So how did that belief actually play out in the laws and legal processes of the time?
Well, one thing was that they had laws specifically against witchcraft. These laws stemmed directly from their interpretation of the Bible and came with some harsh penalties, including death.
So basically, their legal system was enforcing religious beliefs. The line between church and state was pretty blurry.
Absolutely. And that mixing of religious belief and legal authority created a situation where any accusation of witchcraft was taken incredibly seriously. There was no room for nuance.
And we've talked about spectral evidence before. How did that fit into this legal system?
That's where things get really disturbing. Even though spectral evidence was totally subjective and impossible to verify, it was still admissible in court.
So you're telling me someone's dream or vision could be used as actual evidence against someone else? That's pretty hard to wrap my head around.
It was a dangerous and flawed system. It meant that anyone accused had basically no way to defend themselves against these accusations that came from the supernatural realm.
It sounds like the system was set up in a way that made it very easy to make false accusations, with little chance for the accused to prove their innocence.
That's one way to put it. The lack of clear standards for evidence, the heavy reliance on those spectral testimonies, and the pressure on the accused to confess, it all created a perfect storm where accusations could quickly turn into convictions.
What about the idea of innocent until proven guilty, the concept of due process? Was that even a thing in Salem back then?
Not in the way we understand it today. The idea that someone is innocent until proven guilty wasn't really established yet. More often than not, the burden of proof was on the accused to demonstrate their innocence, rather than on the accusers to present solid evidence of guilt.
So basically the deck was stacked against the accused from the very beginning.
In a lot of ways, yes. The legal system in Salem was missing those key principles of fairness and impartiality that we consider fundamental to a just legal system today.
We've talked about how confessing and accusing others often became a way to survive those trials. How did confessions factor into their legal system?
Confessions were seen as extremely valuable in the Salem legal system. They were viewed as irrefutable proof of guilt and could often lead to lighter sentences or even freedom for the person confessing.
But we know that many of those confessions were likely coerced or given under immense pressure.
Exactly. The pressure to confess to save yourself was enormous. It resulted in this perverse incentive for the accused to implicate others, which just kept that cycle of accusations spinning.
So the legal system, instead of protecting innocent people, ended up feeding the very injustices it was meant to prevent.
That's a great way to summarize it. The Salem Witch Trials really highlight the dangers of a legal system that lacks proper safeguards against false accusations and doesn't protect against abuses of power.
It's a reminder, even today, that even within a legal framework, achieving true justice is a constant struggle, especially when fear and prejudice are allowed to take root.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The Salem Witch Trials serve as a warning from history. They remind us that we must be vigilant in protecting the innocent and making sure that the mistakes of the past aren't repeated.
It's a story that still fascinates and horrifies us all these years later. And it's a powerful reminder that we must always strive to protect the innocent and make sure that our legal systems are fair and just. After hearing about all of these witches, we'll be hearing from a man who some have dubbed the Wizard of Oz. Simon will be here with Tom on Sunday, but in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.